Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this latest session of the Network Ed Technology and Education. As usual, as well as the live face-to-face event, it will be streamed, and also a recording will be made available on the Network Ed website shortly after the event. As usual, our hashtag for those who wish to tweet and to ask questions is LSENetEd. And these tweets will be monitored and then questions fed through to the speaker at the end of the presentation. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Lindsay Jordan. Lindsay Jordan is a senior lecturer at the University of the Arts, and she leads a range of master's level courses in academic practice and tries to make effective use of technology with her own students. Good. Lindsay also said she leans towards the playful rather than the serious, which is extremely disappointing because we're exactly the opposite at the LSE. But even allowing for that, I'm sure it will be a great session. So without further ado, I'll ask Lindsay to talk about the needs of a distance learner. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you for all coming today. Thank you for having me here. As I'm sure we'll find out over the next hour, it's really important to have these events where we all come together and learn together. So this is me. If you want to, you can follow me on Twitter, if you dare. Lots of my tweets aren't actually about work, but some of them are. There's a bit of a crossover there, and there's my email address if you want to get in touch with me at any point. So, as Steve said, I want to talk about the needs of the distance learner. And I've been working with distance learners and, as we call them, blended learners, people who also we see face-to-face from time to time as well, across a number of contexts and in a couple of different institutions over the last few years. And so I've learnt a bit about the various challenges that people face when they have to learn in an environment that's actually in their own personal space, rather than an environment that is purely dedicated to the act of learning, with its own distractions. So in this talk, I am going to, you might not be able to see that very well, but I'm going to zoom in a minute. That's actually a map of the sciences, and it's done by measuring all the different kind of clicks that people make when looking at various different academic sources. So I'm going to zoom in again, see if we can get that there. So I'm going to focus not so much on the education area of theory up there, but really looking at social and personality psychology and animal behavior. So I like to mix things up a bit and keep things a bit fresh, and think about maybe some things that, some areas of theory that maybe we haven't considered before, and see how that applies to us. So I'm going to start off with some universal truths. When we want to do something worthy or good, like embark on a program of study, we know that that involves perhaps some pain, some inconvenience, or some hard work. And there's a tension there, okay? We're attracted to this thing, and we're not attracted to this thing at all. This is telling us to avoid it. And psychologists call this approach avoidance conflict. And there's this big tension here in between these two things. And in the animal kingdom, animal behaviorists have observed something very interesting happening when animals come across this approach avoidance conflict. So for example, if you have a squirrel who's tempted by a human holding a nut, the squirrel's torn between their hunger, their desire for the nut, and also their fear of humans. So what the squirrel does is you'll see it pacing around, you'll see it scratching its ears, you might see it shaking its body. Okay, it'll do all these very strange things that have absolutely no relevance at all to wanting the nut or even avoiding the human, okay? And this is called displacement activity. And I think there's a common misconception around displacement activity is it's actually something that we do to avoid the thing that we don't want to do. It's something that we do instead. Actually, animal behaviorists would say that it's not. It's something physical and something comforting that we do to try and get rid of the tension and the stress, to deal with the tension and the stress around this conflict, okay? So when animals encounter this approach avoidance conflict, it's often very much in the moment. Now, as humans, we often deal with stuff that's a bit more longer term. So, our displacement activities might be something around kind of cleaning our house or tidying our desk or something like that. Okay, sound familiar? So that's our first truth. Studying is hard, and that produces this conflict. Maybe some of the people on Twitter, if there's anyone on Twitter, maybe they could share with us, because obviously it's harder when you're not in this kind of situation in this room and there's nothing else that you can do but sit and listen to me. You can't go away and tidy your desk right now because you'd look very rude. You can't start cleaning the floor because people would think you were very strange. But people who are at home, they have that option. So maybe people at home, instead of thinking, oh, actually, that seminar sounds interesting, I'm going to sit down and listen to that, they might have been doing something else. So maybe if there's anyone on Twitter, they might like to share with us perhaps what they almost started doing instead of this. Of course, we probably won't get any responses because they're already sat at the counter, they're already filling up their bucket, ready to wash the floor. So we might not get anything through. But Jane will let us know, I'm sure.
I will let you know. Yes.
Okay. Now, of course, when we do things other than studying, when we choose to do other things other than studying, it's not necessarily a displacement activity. There are lots of much more worthy contenders for our time as well. So these are all the things that we, as distance learners, say, could do rather than studying. We could be spending time with our families. We could be having a great time with our friends. We could be getting some exercise, getting some fresh air, catching up on the complete fourth season of Breaking Bad. And we could be getting some sleep. These are all really important things. These are all things that are good for our health, they're good for our happiness. These are all things that we should also perhaps do. Dreadful word should, but there we go. Sleep, for example. Look at all the reasons why we need to get enough sleep, okay? Impaired moral judgment, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? Impaired immune system, risk of diabetes, growth suppression, risk of obesity, terrible things, okay? So when faced with this kind of evidence, it's surprising that any distance learner would ever make a rational choice and choose studying over sleep, okay? So my students often describe this to me as life getting in the way. If they fail to complete one of my units, they had too much other things going on. There were other choices that they chose. I would say that those other choices are also valid as a fellow distance learner and a fellow human being. Okay. So distance learners have some really difficult choices to make, and it's harder for distance learners to make those choices because as a face-to-face learner, you arguably have one major choice to make. Whether to turn up to class. Once you're in that classroom, you will pretty much do whatever your instructor kind of wants you to do within reason, as long as they don't have too unreasonable requests. Okay, people are very unlikely to walk out. I think I did walk out once in one of Phil Race's sessions when one of his icebreaker activities got a bit too uncomfortable, but that's a different story. So yeah, we have very difficult choices to make as distance learners, and this is actually the flip side of flexibility. Yes, in some ways flexibility is a good thing, but the flip side of flexibility is having to make difficult choices. So choice the choices that we make are determined by motivation, by our motivations. And motivation is a very, very interesting field of study. And when I was looking into this afresh a few days ago, it really dawned on me kind of how many different paradigms and philosophies and perspectives there are about motivation. Plato, for example, he had this tripartite view of the soul, that there were three parts of the soul that were reason, spirit, and appetite. I felt kind of a little bit sorry for Plato when I read this, because I thought if he thought his appetite couldn't be explained by his reason or his spirit, I don't know, I just wanted to give him a hug. I thought that sounded like a bit of an odd situation. Never mind. So yeah, and they all have kind of these competing, perhaps, desires, all these the different parts of the soul. And Freud had another interesting theory as well. He was focused very much on the idea of our unconscious motivations and how they influenced our behaviour. And of course, a lot of his work was about uncovering people's unconscious motivations and the reasons behind them for doing these crazy things that they were doing. So, of course, in education, what we talk about the most is extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Not sure about the examples they've given there. And so I'd like us to think about this for a little bit. But I want us to think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in a particular way. Because rather than thinking about whether this motivation is coming from the self or from outside, I think it's actually more helpful in learning terms to think about this. So intrinsic motivation being about valuing the process of learning. So when we say enjoying learning for learning's sake, looking at the process of learning, and looking at extrinsic motivation as valuing the outcome of learning. Okay? And I want us to think about intrinsic motivation. So I want us to take 5 minutes now, and I want you to work with the person next to you, and think of a time when you felt intrinsically motivated to learn, when you were enjoying learning for learning's sake, and what were the factors that contributed to that? Why were you enjoying learning for learning's sake? Why were you enjoying the learning process? Okay, so we'll take 5 minutes and turn to the person next to you. If you're in a group of 3, work in a 3, and then we'll get some answers back from you. Okay? Would anyone like to volunteer an example? If not, I'll pick on someone. There we go.
Do you want all our examples or just one?
Just pick one, I think.
Okay, well, my one was... Oh, sorry, yes. Okay, so my example, I was doing an online course in philosophy. I had no need to do this course, I just wanted to do it. And I got really far behind, so then I decided I needed to catch up. And while I was catching up, it was like about the 3rd week's worth of material. I suddenly realised that there was no longer this feeling of guilt or anything else driving me. I was just genuinely, I want to know what comes next. I want to learn more. So there was this genuine pleasure in the learning for its own sake.
Yeah.
Even though that had to be orchestrated by the guilt in the first place.
Wow. Yeah. So that's I mean that's kind of really interesting and shows kind of the interplay, I think, between these two things and these different types of motivation. Let's have the other two in your group as well. So.
Mine was an extra course for. I was doing a distance learning course, but what I did a curtain making and blind making course as an additional. I enjoyed doing that because that part of it, there were no exams or anything. It was just basically getting together and doing something I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that process of it.
Yeah.
The distance learning course, I enjoyed doing that, and although I enjoyed doing it, it was very hard. And I found that every time I got to a part which was really hard for me, I tended to go and eat. So I put on a lot of weight.
That was your displacement activity, maybe. Yeah.
My example was learning the piano. And when I started, I had to do exams, and I didn't really like the work of having to put in all that effort to get the piece to a certain standard at a certain date. So I actually gave up doing the exams, and I continued to play the piano for about 10 years. And when I actually enjoyed it more, when I didn't have the exams, and I could just put the time in, learn the pieces when I wanted to.
Fantastic. So those are kind of two very similar examples there, and one very different. And by that I mean the kind of interplay, the role that these extrinsic factors were having, the impact that they were having on the intrinsic factors. So in this way, this was actually driving your activity in the first place. The guilt, which was quite an extrinsic factor, but then once you got going, you were actually really enjoying it as you knew you would do, which was the reason why you signed up for it in the first place. And then in both your cases, the fact that there was a kind of an extrinsic reward kind of attached to it actually put you off, because it came along with all these pressures and these must-haves. Well, yours didn't, but that was the reason why you enjoyed it. So yeah, fantastic examples that really show the interplay between these two things. They're not separate. They shouldn't be separated. And they're both very, there's a lot of interplay between them. Okay, so thinking about more about the extrinsic factors, thinking about these rewards, these outcomes, and how they influence our motivation. There's something called expectancy theory, which was come up with by this chap in the 60s, Victor Vroom. Fantastic name, Vroom. It's a very motivational name. So, and he came up with this very simple little algorithm. So he said that motivation is basically these 3 things multiplied together. So that all these 3 things have a massive impact on motivation. So it's a kind of chain of events. So expectancy, he's saying, is the belief that you put in effort and your effort will pay off. So for example, if you're learning the piano, that you will actually practice and you'll get better. Okay? So the effort will result in better performance. And then secondly, that the better performance will actually have an outcome. Like, for example, you'll pass your piano exam. okay? And then that third factor is valence, is the desirability of that outcome. So if you don't care one way or the other whether you pass your piano exam, the rest doesn't really kind of matter. But if you know, the more you care about it, you know, everything else will increase massively. So this is the idea behind expectancy theory and how reward-based motivation appears to work. And so this is the part of the brain that we talk about when we talk about rewards. This is very tiny bit. And what it does is the activity in this area of the brain called the ventral striatum, it really kind of starts to buzz when we think about the reward or the outcome, or when we expect it, and also when we get it. So it's kind of like a little U shape, okay? So if we expect a reward, and then we get it when we've actually achieved what we set out to. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to go back to our squirrel now. Does anyone remember what our squirrel's dilemma was? The human and the nut, okay? So the human's offering this squirrel a nut, and it's caught between its fear of humans and its desire for the nut, okay? Now, I just want to check before we go ahead with this, does everyone like squirrels? Does anyone not like squirrels? Steve, you're not a fan of squirrels, okay? You can probably sit this one out, so just sit quietly, okay? Now, does anyone have an allergy, a nut allergy? No? Fantastic. Jolly good, jolly good. So I'm going to hand out these nuts, so you can, we'll just take some nuts, okay? Hold out your hand. There we go. So pass them down, and you can eat them afterwards if you want, but not yet, because we need to use them for the experiment. Yeah, oh yeah, you get nuts. Nuts for the workers. There we go. Okay. So this is just a thought experiment, but you know, this is proper pedagogic theory. You know, you need to make things as realistic as possible for people. This is called situated learning. Right, okay. So everyone's got some nuts. You'll be pleased to know I did have some nuts for the people who are allergic as well. There we go. Always prepared. Right, okay. So we have our lovely squirrel here, and he's caught in this dilemma. And of course, you know, you all like squirrels. Apart from Steve, he's out of the room. He's out of the room. So we know that nothing bad is going to happen to this squirrel if he comes and takes your nut. So we really want him to actually, you know, overcome his fear and learn to kind of come and take the nuts. All right. So, little thought experiment. I want you to imagine we have a whole class of squirrels now. Okay. So we have a whole class of squirrels, and a master squirrel who has conquered his fear of humans and now has a lovely big juicy nut to show for it. Okay? Now I can see a couple of you are thinking, you know, what's wrong with this picture, you know, because you're all kind of, you work in learning and teaching, so I understand that. So there we go, that's a bit better, isn't it? So now we have our squirrels in their classroom arranged correctly. I want you to think about this situation, that they're all going to kind of try and learn together how to overcome their fear and come and get your nuts, all right? So how might these new factors that we've just introduced impact on the squirrel's choice about whether to run away or whether to come and get your nuts? I want you to have a think about that. And then we're going to get as many answers from you as possible, okay? So 5 minutes. Okay, right then. Let's get some ideas back from you. This group of guys at the back here, in a group of 3, all wearing lovely matching shirts. Did you coordinate for me? What are you wearing today? Any ideas? How is it going to be easier for them in this situation to overcome their fear and get the nut than the poor old squirrel working by itself? What factors are there? I think it should be working. It won't amplify. It's just for the recording.
There's something quite different from the online learning, which is we are doing in the classroom. Because in online learning, maybe the students have their own choice of how and when they will learn. So sometimes, if the teacher put on everything, he thinks it will be appropriate for their students, but the student will choose something else or in a different pace. And another thing is, traditionally we thought that the teacher will always be the master and the student will always be the receptive. But online learning may be something quite different. The student may be learn from other resources beside their pair students, maybe someone else, to compare with their teachers. For example, we have OER now, which is quite immersive online. Yeah, that's what
Okay. Hey, you're taking this quite far. I think there's so there's in this kind of situation as well. I think they're probably, because they're sat in groups, and there's probably that that ability for them to share ideas with each other about how they might conquer their fear. And they might kind of find it easier to kind of give someone, it's always easier to give someone else advice than it is to give yourself advice. So you know, there is probably that opportunity to peer learn as well. And I think just having kind of that master teacher there, you know, he's not necessarily, he doesn't look very active in the class. He looks like he's just walking around looking thoughtful, like I do most of the time, to be honest. But, you know, the fact that he's got his nut and is clearly enjoying it is probably, you know, a good kind of sign. It's like you're making it more explicit. You're making the reward more explicit. So this whole idea about the expectancy, you know, if I put in the effort, will I get the nut? You know, what's it worth getting the nut? Well, he's enjoying it. It looks good. So there's, you know, there's a more explicit sense of that reward there. Okay, Jane, what did your group come up with?
Well, I think we talked about the fact that the squirrel, well, kind of about the peer learning thing, I think, was one of the things, that the squirrels in the groups could kind of bounce ideas off each other and sort of talk about tactics and, you know, share their experience. I once went up to a human and they didn't attack me, and, you know, kind of also get reassurance from each other. So that's mainly, I think, what we were talking about. I don't know if Maria or Natalia wanted to add anything.
Okay, so the actual kind of learning benefit of working in the group as well. Now, what do you think about them actually working in the group? Do you think they actually probably, you know, that was quite an enjoyable experience for them, possibly?
Yeah, definitely.
Probably distracted from the fear of us standing here with all our nuts, maybe.
Yeah,
so it was a kind of a bit of a distraction, perhaps, and maybe an enjoyable factor in itself. Anyone come up with anything different? Have I covered all bases, Sonia?
Well, I'm still not entirely sure. I don't think.
Okay, anyone else come up with anything else? No, I think we might have covered everything. So these are the things I thought of, but I think you probably, you know, came up with something a bit more beyond. So these are the kind of the process, the intrinsic things that we're thinking about when, you know, we're thinking about these squirrels all working together in groups like this in a class with a teacher. So their fear of the situation is possibly reduced. You know, this idea of, you know, safety in numbers, even though there's more of us. You know, perhaps they feel safer, you know, altogether, less exposed. Maybe their tolerance of the fear is increased because they're maybe distracted by actually the enjoyable nature of this situation, all kind of being together and being social. That social aspect in itself is enjoyable, you know, coming together, meeting people. That's something that we enjoy. We get a lot of pleasure from it. Also, something that didn't come up, I forgot about this, the opportunity to impress others, okay? So if you're by yourself, and you're in a situation and you have the opportunity to do something impressive, it's not going to be very impressive if you're the only person there, okay? So now, you know, if one of those squirrels now gets up, walks over to Sonia and grabs her nut, he's impressed all those squirrels in the class and the teacher as well. So there we go. That's probably a bit of both. That's a bit of a reward, and it's also something that we might enjoy for the sake of it as well. So the reward we talked about, you know, it's the fact that this master teacher and maybe, you know, maybe other squirrels in the class might kind of start going out and grabbing nuts. They can see others getting nuts. This is the expectancy. They can see the value of getting the nut. And that's what Mr. Vroom would call instrumentality. Okay, so my little tenuous link there with back to the squirrels. Learning is easier with other people. It's much easier with other people. And so this is obviously very relevant where it comes to distance learning, because we get to spend less time with other people with distance learning, okay? Now with my blended learners, I actually find that although there are ample opportunities, should they wish to take them, to interact with other people, and this is something you often find with the distance learning courses, that we can put as many forums out there and wikis out there as we want. And we actually find it's like kind of, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Okay? There are other pressures on their time, and it often surprises learning designers and teachers who work with distance learners how few people take those opportunities to actually interact with people, considering how enjoyable we know it is to interact with other people and the learning benefits of working with other people. Okay? So I tend to force mine to work with other people, I have to say. I use the stick of summative assessment to force them to interact, to work together, to write on their blogs, to actually assess each other. Because if I want them to write on their blogs, and I want kind of 50 of my students to produce these great reams of stuff every month, I can't assess all that kind of stuff. I have to make them do it. So they work together, they decide on what they're going to mark each other on. This is the marking criteria that some of them drafted up in the early stages of the course. And they assess each other on that. So I force them to do that, and that's worth half of their mark for their unit, for their course. So if they don't do this, they fail the course. Now, we talked earlier about, with your examples, about the piano playing, about this idea of the extrinsic factors sometimes undermining intrinsic motivation. And I found that that can be true. Okay? So I get feedback from my students on my course, and they say, well, the fact that I was forced into doing it, it made it all a little bit false, perhaps. And I felt kind of quite self-conscious. That wasn't a way I would have chosen to communicate. It's not a format in which I'm used to communicating in. Okay? And something that's maybe more relevant. I mean, this one was talking about getting children to play with magic markers. Okay? So this one's slightly more specific to the situation. Talking about the use of blogs for educational purposes. Talking about it killing its spirit. Okay? And I can very much understand that. Because it's like exactly what we were saying about, you felt that having to work towards these exams almost kind of killed the spirit of it, the spirit of enjoyment. And when that was taken away, you actually did much better. And that's sometimes the case with some people. So it's a difficult choice to make. Because there is a flip side to it. Because when I analysed the first time that I did this quite thoroughly, and I did a big kind of coding exercise with everyone's responses, and the word forcing or forced came up quite a lot. It came up 3 times more often in the positive comments column, okay? This is the really interesting thing. It was a good way of forcing me to do the reading. It was a good way of forcing me to do these activities. Having the blog forced me to get to grips with this communication technology, okay? So people are recognizing that they're being forced, they're being pushed into doing something. Many of them are also appreciating it. I'm not saying it's altogether an ideal situation. Perhaps it's the best of 2 evils. Discuss. So sometimes people need and want to be pushed to interact, despite us knowing that it's pleasurable, it's good for our learning. Okay? Now I'm going to break off and tell you a story now. It's 22, got enough time, good. So I'm going to tell you a story of a yachting race that was held in the late 60s. It was the first round the world solo yachting race. Does anyone know the story of the Golden Globe race? Fantastic. They set up in Falmouth. Yeah, it was sponsored by the Sunday Times. Okay, so the Sunday Times decided to sponsor this round the world solo yachting race in 1968, and 9 yachtsmen entered, and this was the route. They started off in Falmouth, in Devon. And they went round the west coast of Africa, down the Cape of Good Hope, and all the way along what they call the Roaring Forties, across the Pacific Ocean, round Cape Horn, back up, doubling back their path before, and back to Falmouth. So that was the idea, that was the proposed route. And 9 yachtsmen originally entered. 5 of them actually kind of only really lasted a matter of weeks. So, they had massive problems with their boats. Things fell apart. They couldn't go on. They had to retire from the race. So I'm going to talk to you about the 4 who actually kind of went on beyond that point. So, and they all have very interesting stories. So this is the guy who won. And this guy is called Robin Knox Johnston. You might have heard of him, okay? And yeah, he liked a whiskey, a nip, and a smoke. He's been called a salty old sea dog. He's still around. He was originally in the Merchant Navy, I think, and spent many years in the Navy, and was, you know, a massively keen sailor. And he won the race. It took him about 9 months, I think. This is Donald Crowhurst, and this is quite a sad story. What happened to Donald is he set out. Donald had actually bargained quite a lot on this race. He'd pretty much kind of sold everything he owned to fund it. He had a lot at stake. And he spent, after spending quite a lot of weeks on his yacht, he started to doubt himself. And he started to doubt himself to the point of where he thought it would actually be a good idea to cheat. And to, let's go back to show you the map, what Donald did. He went down as far as here, and then he thought, actually, I'm just going to go over here and wait here for the others to come round. He thought this would be a good idea. And what he did was he started to radio in false reports and to create false logs. And these were incredibly intricate because it involved doing celestial kind of navigation backwards. Incredibly intricate. So he was creating these false logs, and he was creating real ones at the same time. And kind of trying to keep abreast of where the others were, kind of by radio and everything like that. So that's what Donald did. Nigel Tetley. So Nigel, his trip was relatively uneventful. He kind of kept on going, kind of until he reached this point. Oh, I don't know how to go back quickly. This point round here, and then the people on the radio reports, kind of he heard that Donald Crowhurst was actually ahead of him, or either just behind him, or at least, you know, on a par with him. Of course, those reports were false because Donald had been, you know, resting over there for quite a few months. So what Nigel did was he really pushed his boat. His boat was really suffering. It probably would have survived if he kept on going the speed he was going, but he decided to really push it. So he really pushed it. And with about 1,000 miles to go, the boat collapsed, and he had to be rescued. What happened later on is very sad. He wrote a book about the story. The book didn't do very well. He never recovered the money back to rebuild his boat, and he committed suicide 3 years later. What happened to Donald was equally as sad. Donald, when he found out that what had happened, realized that kind of people would find him out, and he committed suicide actually down here before the race was over. So there's one more person, and this is an even more interesting story, not quite as sad, very happy story. This is Bernhard Moretti. And what happened to Bernhard was he got kind of around the Pacific Ocean, and he got very depressed. But what Bernhard did was he discovered yoga. And so he started a lot of yoga on his yacht and a lot of meditation. And he started thinking, actually, I don't want to go back to Europe because that's where all my problems started. So what Bernhard did was he carried on going. Okay, so Bernhard carried on going. He went all the way around there. Rather than coming back up to Falmouth, he carried on going and ended up in Tahiti, where his wife flew out to meet him, and they lived happily. Well, not ever after, for a while. I think he died in the 90s. So, isolation does funny things to people. It's very powerful. And there's clearly something very, very special about this guy, about Robin Knox Johnston. He's still alive. He was on a BBC programme recently. This is the kind of guy who, before he did this round-the-world race, he wanted his wife and his first newborn daughter to sail back on his boat with him to England from Bombay. She refused, and he refused to budge as well. So they divorced. Then Robin went around the world, won this race, did another race, won that, and they got back together. They married, and they lived happily until 2003, when his wife sadly died. But he's still going. He did a BBC programme recently with Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who was the other guy? John Simpson. And this was by the BBC, and it was called Top Dogs. And it was this kind of adventuring thing where they all kind of tried each other's sports and maybe tried to outdo each other. And there was a very interesting quote that I read, and he was talking about how the producers of the program, as TV producers tried to get inside their heads, tried to find out more about them, tried to find out their weaknesses, tried to play on them a little bit. And these three guys, they had this plan. Every time they would try and do that, they would just repeat their name and their rank and their number, something like that, yeah? So this is a guy he's had military training. He's incredibly stoic, unusually so. And this is how he managed to emerge from this 9-month solo voyage almost completely unscathed, it seems, whereas everyone else completely fell apart. So that's the top dogs. So the tenuous link that I'm making here, most people can't handle isolation. Only a very small number of people can. These people are very special, okay? And the people who succeed at distance learning are often very special kind of people. Most people can't work that way. They need people. They need to be around people. They need to converse with people, synchronously at least, if not face to face. Now, I know what you're going to say, because a lot of you are kind of, very technologically minded, I'm sure, especially those of you in the Centre for Learning Technology. And you're going to say, but now we have the internet, okay? These people on this yachting race in the late 60s, they didn't have the internet. They had a radio, and that was it. Now we have many ways of communicating, of staying in touch, okay? Are we getting less isolated? No. Are we getting more isolated? According to this, okay? So this is a study that was done in 2009, or the years leading up to 2009, and it compares the number of intimate connections we have with people, okay? So people who we identify that we can confide in. And so it's gone down by a third between 1985 and 2004, in almost 20 years, 2 decades. Our number of intimate friends has gone down. More significant, perhaps, is this increase in this proportion of people who identify as having no one they can confide in. Okay, 7% in the mid-80s, and now it's up to nearly a quarter of us. Nearly a quarter of us feel that we don't have anyone we can actually confide in.
Where was this research? In which country?
It was in America. Ellen MacArthur, she is a yachtswoman, a solo yachtswoman. She has access to internet, she has access to Skype, everything. She can have messages coming in from people she doesn't know, messages of support, everything like this. She still has to find ways of coping with the isolation that she experiences on her solo voyages, okay? Many people often laugh about Ellen MacArthur about the way that she cries a lot, okay? It's a very typical kind of thing. This is a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism for the stress and the tension caused by the isolation, by being alone for such long periods and not having another human being to kind of be with and to share those emotions with in a very kind of genuine physical way. So when I read this kind of thing that comes from, this is from Nathan Harden. This is an article that came out last month, I think, or February. So now anyone in the world with an internet connection can access the kind of high-level teaching and scholarship that was previously available to only a small number of students. And it talks about these MOOCs, massive open online courses, which he reckons are poised to change forever the way that universities teach. And so I look at this and I think, is that actually going to happen? And I look at the MOOCs that are around, and I've done some, and there are a vast range, ranging from ones that actually are quite good at bringing people together and having this kind of sense of coming together, and many that actually are just like pretty much reading a book and keep you completely isolated. So let's go back 20 years, and in the Open Learning Journal, which I think is published by the Open University, this was 21 years ago. So this is a guy called Greville Rumble, and he wrote a piece on what he called dual mode universities, which is pretty much, lots of universities offer distance learning courses. I think it's about half of the universities in the UK offer distance learning courses. So we're called dual mode universities. We offer both face-to-face and distance learning courses. Dual mode universities can exploit the advantages of marginal costs. Okay, so he's talking from a very economic perspective, very financial economic perspective here. They're saying that they can develop courses cheaper. They can provide more varied distance education more cheaply than distance teaching universities. Okay, so like the Open University, for example. And apparently there can be this backwash as well. We can double up. We can use the materials that we produce for our distance learning students, and we can use them in our face-to-face teaching, so that cuts costs. And there's a synergy between our on and off course programs. So this is what he's saying he's envisaging for the future. Distance teaching universities are thus in a competitively vulnerable position. Okay, so this was 20 years ago. So what he's talking about, has that happened? Has the Open University gone under? Have we taken over from them? Not at all. Okay. There was a special issue released last year of the Open Learning Journal. It's really interesting. I would recommend checking it out if you haven't already. And this was taken from an audio interview with Helen Lentel, who is the guest editor of that edition. And it's looking back. It's looking back at what we thought would happen, and it's also looking forward, thinking about what Nathan Harden was saying about MOOCs, about open online courses, about the future of the university. And she's saying that distance learning is still a very marginal activity. Okay, and we're still using the same infrastructure that we use for our the bread and butter of our student body, which are coming into education full time, coming in at 18, leaving at 21. So our systems haven't really changed, they haven't diversified, and they can't really accommodate distance learners. So she also says, this is very interesting, in the distance learning community, we've been complicit in this conceptual confusion. We haven't pressed hard enough for this to change. And I can see why she's saying that, and I can see what I've done over the years in my job, working in distance learning, and I've done it because I've been passionate about it. And I've been passionate about taking a course, perhaps, and making an online version of it because it's been my passion. It's been a little cottage industry, okay? And I haven't when someone said, oh, that's great what you're doing, and I haven't said, well, I'm going to stop doing it now until, you change the infrastructure, because I'm not going to do that, because I'm loving what I'm doing. So I can see why she's saying that we're being complicit. Something that I do with quite a few of my students when they come on my courses, because my courses are about learning and teaching, not necessarily distance learning, but about learning and teaching theory. So I ask them what teaching is. And I know you can't read that, I'm just showing it to you to prove that I actually do some work. So this is a version that you can actually read. And this is the kind of stuff that I get back from them. These are all the kind of aspects of teaching that they identify. And I have arranged them into different areas. And this is the kind of the stuff, the content-based stuff, the giving. Okay, this is what I'm giving you, the content. And that's very valid. It's all very valid, And there's something that's a little bit in the middle. So it's something that goes beyond the content. It's working with the content. It's asking the questions about the content, okay? And it's providing something beyond the actual content, something slightly more emotional, perhaps. And then there's this stuff here. And this is the really in-depth stuff about the relationship between the teacher and the learner. Okay, so it's bringing people together. It's actually assessing what's going on, closing that loop. It's giving feedback. It's providing individual support and guidance and putting the systems in place for that to happen. It's encouraging people when when they're feeling down or feeling unable to do something. And it's challenging people as well. It's identifying when people are having trouble understanding something or perhaps moving on with perhaps a different way of doing something and asking the right questions to perhaps get them to question what they're doing. So, just thought I'd show you that. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So, another point, so most universities can't actually handle distance learners. That's why I'm arguing. bit of a bold claim. Because they're not providing enough of this in the distance learning courses that they provide. Okay. This is something interesting that you might not be aware of. RDI, and there are other companies across the world who do this kind of thing. They're kind of companies who work in partnership with universities to deliver distance learning, and they have, some of the infrastructure that is designed to kind of support online distance learning, various things like assessment tools, the right kind of virtual learning environments, but they have to work in partnership with other universities who actually validate the programs. So that's part of the infrastructure is sitting within the universities. I think there's Bradford University and Anglia Ruskin work with RDI. So the quality assurance, the validation processes are going on in those universities. And then there's other processes, other aspects of the infrastructure that are kind of carried out and supplied by companies such as RDI. So MOOCs. I think a great thing for people to do, if you're actually interested in this, as I am, is to take part in MOOCs. Not in a scattergun way, but you know, choosing something that actually means something to you. Something that isn't going to require too much of your time, because really it's about actually, you know, experiencing it for yourself. And I think actually more people in senior management in universities really need to try to go into, you know, this open culture site. It's fantastic. It's just openculture.org, I think. And you can just scroll down this list of these MOOCs that are starting at any particular point. And some of them have fixed start points. Many of them are free. And it's arranged by start date. You can just scroll down and look at what's starting in April or May. And you can choose something like basic calculus or learning to be creative or anything like that. Places like Stanford, MIT, University of Utah. Most of them are based in the United States. And you know, they're kind of usually about 6-week courses, and that you can kind of dip in and try something out. And they often have little codes on them so that you can see what you get in that course. So you can see, you know, whether you'll be required to do peer assessment in that course, whether you'll get the opportunity to interact with instructors on that course. And as you scroll down and as you click on the different courses, you'll realize that there is a massive, vast variation in these different courses and what you get. So one course, for example, might be a series of video lectures and a series of quizzes. And this is what I mean when I say, you know, these courses that are offering all of the pink stuff and none of the yellow. Okay. So, for example, creating quality online instruction by the University of Utah. So, provides opportunities to interact with instructor or students. Use discussion forums. Some of your work will be assessed by a content expert. Some of your work will be assessed by peers. You will be expected to work with a group of other students. And it's intended for educators or professionals. Now, often, what I find is the stuff that's about, the courses that are about online learning, are the best online courses. Now, that's a no-brainer. Okay, it always has been the case. The first MOOCs were about online learning. They were about personal learning networks. They were about connectivism. Okay. So these people were the experts, so of course they were going to deliver good online collaborative learning experiences. In comparison, Genes and the Human Condition is one of those ones that just has some videos and some multiple choice quizzes. You do get a certificate though. And you know, it's up to you really, but perhaps I think that those courses are maybe only doing half the job, okay? Which is maybe worse than doing nothing at all. They're doing this, but they're not actually providing any of this. And there are many kind of maybe negative aspects to that. Maybe providing people with a false sense of security about they're actually going in to do a course, but really they're just getting content without any support, any interaction, and they're going to be completely isolated. Now, what is the point in putting something online where the main benefit of something being online is, you know, the massive potential there is for connecting with people without any opportunities to connect? Now, one of the best MOOCs that I ever did was CCK11, which was a MOOC on connectivism and connectivist knowledge. This is fantastic. You can still go back into it, and you can read all the daily newsletters, you can look at all the lectures, you can look at all the sessions that we did. And the thing that I think really helps me with this, the thing that got me through to the end of the 12 weeks and really gave me the buzz, was the bi-weekly lectures, the synchronous lectures where you actually come together and you get this sense of being in a room with people and having this banter. You know, during the 12 weeks, you know, I didn't attend every single one of the 24 lectures, the 24 seminars, but I attended quite a few. And that was enough to kind of see the same face. I say see the same face. I wasn't seeing a face at all. I didn't even know whether these people were male or female. Some of them had names like Monkey. I don't know. So, but you know, you would get to know this person and the kind of things they would say, and that would be enough for you to start up a little bit of banter, to refer back to something that they said before. You know, you'd have this feeling that these people were your mates, your buddies, and that was so powerful. You can't underestimate how powerful that feeling was. And there's a word that I'm sure someone else has come up with this word before me. Maybe Dave White, I think he might have mentioned it. Inventiveness, okay? This feeling of there being an event, of coming together. And I think that's really important. And it's perhaps, you know, something that people can add into their online courses at, you know, not too great an expense and with not too much change to the infrastructure, perhaps. There's a little example before I finish for questions. This was Pi Day. And this was Dave White, who I just mentioned, who also came to speak to you last summer, I think, was involved with this. And this was a collaboration between Oxford, University of Oxford, and I think JISC NetSkills were involved in that with kind of providing the technology and the server, etc. And what happened was this was just 50 minutes. It was a 50-minute event, a live event that happened in the middle of March. And it was a collaborative event to crowdsource pi. So finding different ways of coming up with pi, but you know, they're measuring the number of diameters in the circumference of a circle. Okay, so Marcus de Sortoy here from University of Oxford is very, very humorously holding up a real pi. So it was great. I think they had at least kind of, well, maybe 2,000 people kind of collaborating online live during that 50 minutes. And at the end of you can't see the actual mean average that's coming down there, but they got, you know, they got very close to what it actually is. So it was great. So, but I think that's a really nice example of how something can kind of really pull people together, just something short like that, and really create this sense of an event. So to conclude, studying is hard. Other choices are also valid. Seeing friends, sleeping, exercising, these are all very tough choices that we have to make. Learning is a lot easier with people, although sometimes people need to be pushed to interact. Most people can't handle isolation. Some people can. At the moment, very few people are succeeding at distance learning, and that's those very few people. But it's not a mass thing, it's a marginal activity. Most universities don't deal with distance learning very well. Their infrastructures are set up for face-to-face learning. Events, live events, are really, really useful. Okay, questions? One over here, so Mike, I think it's first.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about your last point about events.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded great, what you had in CCK, and I'm just trying to transfer that into my MOOC experience.
Yep.
And I can't see it working. And
right.
The reason why is that I tried to use the forums in my MOOC, and you started off with 90,000 students, which inevitably plummeted as it went on. But every time you went into the forums, you were seeing posts from different people. There was never any sense of getting to know anyone on the course or getting any kind of continual sort of representation of anyone's ideas. It was just a bunch of ideas thrown at a wall every single time.
Yeah.
Now, if that course had organised an event, I personally can't imagine there would be any value to it, because it would simply be the teacher talking at me. It would be, I would know it was live, but it would still be like the talking head to all intents and purposes. I would see lots of names in a room, but I wouldn't know who they were, and I can't quite imagine how you would manage any interaction from them.
Yeah.
So why was it different in your MOOC? How did that work?
I think what really helped was the idea that, yes, there was a lot going on, but you could just hang on a few kind of familiar names, perhaps. And there were kind of little cliques, and I mean that in a good way, in a sense, kind of beginning to form. And, perhaps if you had been able to find one or two people to hang on to, and I know lots of MOOCs that are kind of trying to employ this now, trying to get people to set up small study groups, small feedback groups, to try and break up this enormous mass of people. And then that can really help. And I think that was what was going on, that I had this little friendship group that was perhaps maybe 4 or 5 people. And we would kind of banter, and there were other kind of groups doing the same. So that is one strategy, perhaps, if that helps.
So you can imagine maybe a MOOC or something like that could actually implement that throughout the whole site, so that every activity you did within a course, you'd have the option of restricting yourself to your study group.
Yes, and I've seen that work. I've also seen it work not very well as well. So, you know, you give people too much free rein, perhaps, to set up your own groups, and inevitably some people will try and form groups that are too large, and some people will get missed out. What I do in my own teaching, which perhaps you might not find relevant because I'm talking about a group of about 50, is I actually physically put them into random groups to start off with. And in the vast majority of situations, that works. I do get a couple of people saying, oh, you know, I'm not sure if my group have much to say to me about my teaching subject because they all teach things that are so different. You know, I'd actually rather be working with that teacher over there who teaches the same thing as I do. But those people are actually very much in the minority. It's so important to me to have those small groups, those small functional groups, that I just design activities that are actually based on those groups actually being made up of people who teach different things. So it's coming together and bringing ideas and sharing from their different areas of practice. So that's how the activities are designed, because it's really the important thing to me is to have those functional groups. Okay?
Lindsay, thank you. I enjoyed that very much. I've got a number of conflicting thoughts in my head, but that's obviously good, because that's one of the purposes of these kinds of sessions. I think there are a few potential dangers in some of the things you were saying. Not that you would necessarily fall into them, of course, but I think they're there. First of all, there's possibly a tendency to suggest that conventional universities equal good, open universities or distance learning is somehow less good. For example, when you had your slide about what is teaching, you saw a little bit of pink and a lot of yellow. I suspect in reality in many universities there's an awful lot more pink and much less yellow actually happening.
I think that was simply the case that, you know, there were only a few ways that they could think of to describe the delivering of content.
Sure, I think that's the case, but I think the point I'm making is that sometimes conventional universities can be very content-led, and they're not necessarily offering quite that wide experience which perhaps might be implied.
Yeah.
But also, following on from that, I think there's a lot of merit in the arguments of people like Daphne Koller about MOOCs when you look at conventional bricks and mortar universities and the sheer number of students globally who would like access to higher education and who can't afford that. But there does not seem to be any way in which conventional universities can actually address that need. Therefore, we do need to examine ways in which an online environment, which potentially can reach large numbers, can be developed in order to address that really pressing social need.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I'm saying is that, yes, they do need to do that, but they can't underestimate how much isolation impacts on the learning experience. They have to really, you know, make reducing isolation the cornerstone of their learning design in a way. That's what I'm saying. They need to do that. We need to address this global problem, but we need to make sure we're not kind of thinking, oh, I'm producing some videos and some multiple choice tests, that's going to be sufficient for, you know, addressing the needs of the population.
Sort of numbers stack up on learners that kind of like or flourish in isolation and ones that don't?
Well,
say the boat example.
Yeah.
Two seemed quite happy and two jumped overboard.
Well, I mean, out of the 9, the yachts people, the 9, 5, kind of quit quite early on. And we don't really know kind of if they'd been luckier perhaps and their boats had lasted, whether they would have the mental toughness or the mental characteristics to emerge unscathed. But yeah, I mean, those 4 whose boats went the distance, certainly 2 crumbled mentally. And, you know, perhaps Bernhard Moretti, he changed. He didn't crumble. You could say he got stronger in a way, but he certainly changed. And only, you know, one of them, clearly, Robin, kind of emerged unscathed. And I would say, perhaps, it's difficult to say when, you know, because obviously I work with blended learners and I force them to interact in this way. And so I have quite low attrition rates. But I've worked on courses before which have been not like that, perhaps. And the attrition rates have been kind of very high, around about perhaps 70 up to 80%, perhaps. And these are courses that actually people are actually paying quite a significant amount of money for. Okay, so you need to kind of look at the situation, you need to look at what people are actually committing. If people are committing a large amount into it, that's giving them an extra motivation to actually carry on. If you're looking at the attrition rates on kind of these free courses, I was looking at one the other day, and I think it was about online, it was about designing for online learning, I think. And there were 10 kind of units in it, 10 topics. And the idea was that they kind of posed a task, and the participants were supposed to kind of upload their response to that task as a comment below that post. And on the first week's post, there were 5, and then on the next 9, there weren't anything. Okay, so it depends what people are actually putting in and bringing to the situation. And that's often a measure of how intrinsically motivated they are to do something, how much they will actually commit to it. So if it's a free course, they really don't have much threshold of commitment to kind of produce. So the drop-off rate is going to be probably quite low. You know, whether that matters or not, people have argued that, you know, if people are producing this kind of content and giving it for free, what does it matter if people dip in and actually just get whatever they want from it? And that's a valid point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's how you measure. So if there's no
Yes.
there, but someone
Yeah.
might spring off,
Yeah.
it's open.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somewhere else and
Exactly.
they
And I think this is a really crucial point, because with some of these MOOCs where there is very little interaction, you are losing that really, really important aspect of teaching, which is actually gaining feedback on how things are going. If you haven't got that mechanism there for feedback about what people are finding useful, what people are finding problematic, what people just don't get, how on earth can you then change your practices in order for things to get better? So that's a really valid point. I'm really glad you asked it.
maybe some web analytics to see where
Yes,
rather than just crude
absolutely.
comments
Yes.
and leave.
Yeah, absolutely. So that needs to be put into place as well. So not just thinking about the student experience and thinking about how people can actually get their kind of interaction with each other, thinking about how you are going to get information back about that, about how students are finding the course and how they're learning. It's a crucial part of teaching, getting feedback on your teaching.
Could I ask one more question? Lindsay, what advice would you give to a university such as the LSE who are vaguely thinking about MOOCs?
Don't think about it vaguely. Think about it much more firmly if you're going to do it. That would be my advice.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we're running out of questions, so yes, I'd like everybody to thank you.